We have reason to believe the Russian forces are planning to and intend to attack Ukraine in the coming week, in the coming days. We believe that they will target Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million innocent people. Make no mistake, if Russia pursues its plans, it will be responsible for a catastrophic and needless war of choice. The United States and our allies are prepared to defend every inch of NATO territory from any threat to our collective security as well. We also will not send troops in to fight in Ukraine, but we will continue to support the Ukrainian people.
I'm now joined by DW's Stefan Simons in Washington. So Joe Biden seems convinced that Russia intends to invade. Do we know how the U.S. will respond if this conflict turns hot?
Well, we have heard the most blunt comments so far from the president, I think, with what he just said. You're absolutely right. But yeah, the U.S. is, says the president, and his administration prepared to impose very, very, very severe sanctions on Russia. So with NATO allies, with European partners, they're working actually, and this is a quote from a press conference earlier today from the White House, on finalization of a severe final package, sanctions package. And what is in this package of sanctions? It's of course financial sanctions, cutting Russia out of the global market when it comes to finances, and export controls, meaning that those sanctions will be then designed to not allow Russia to import anything from the European Union and the United States, which would be, says the White House, a strategic loss for Russia and a calamity for President Putin. But as you pointed out, and what the president pointed out, there seems to be a waning confidence in the chance of diplomacy for Ukraine right now.
All right, so it does seem that there's a lack of confidence in a diplomatic solution, but can there be any type of diplomatic path out of this crisis from the perspective of Washington?
Well, I think that Washington is still hopeful. Americans are still hopeful, and the White House is still hopeful. There is a meeting scheduled for next week between Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. This is supposed to be happening at the end of the week, 24th of February, apparently, but the president made really clear that if, of course, Russia opts for, and Vladimir Putin opts for an invasion into Ukraine before this meeting happens, then he is potentially right with his assessment that Vladimir Putin already made his mind up on an invasion and on an attack on Ukraine, and that diplomacy has no chance. However, I think so far, as of now, everybody wants to actively, here in the United States, here in Washington, probably also in European capitals, give diplomacy still a chance.
That was Stefan Simons joining us from Washington. Thank you. The U.S. says Russia now has up to 190,000 troops positioned along its border with Ukraine. Tomorrow, Moscow plans military drills of its nuclear arsenal, a show of strength that NATO says is an attempt to intimidate. Meanwhile, Moscow-backed separatists are evacuating civilians from eastern Ukraine to Russia, claiming the Ukrainian army is planning an attack.
A warning to the people of Donetsk that it's time to go after the heads of the separatist regions announced evacuation plans.
The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, will soon order the military to go on the offensive to implement a plan to invade the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic's territory. As of today, February 18th, a mass centralized evacuation of the population to the Russian Federation has been organized.
Women, children, and the elderly are among the first to be evacuated, packed onto buses bound for Russia's neighboring Rostov region, despite Kiev again denying any plans for military action.
I reiterate that the military and political leadership of Ukraine doesn't plan and are not conducting offensive operations in Ukraine's east. The only option for deoccupation of the people and territory that is acceptable to us is the political and diplomatic one.
According to Kiev, it's the separatists who have upped their attacks. And it's homes like these on their side of the front line, Luhansk, that have been caught in the firing line. Locals say shelling has escalated lately.
Recently, it has been quiet. And then the last 2 days, every now and then they shoot. Every now and then they shoot.
But Donetsk too has seen increased attacks. A car bomb was detonated in the heart of the city on Friday evening. The reported owner, the head of the separatist region's military, was not inside at the time. The explosion comes just days after the US and its allies warned about potential false flag attacks by Russia. For President Putin, the solution to the current crisis lies with Kiev.
All Kiev needs to do is sit down at the negotiating table with representatives of Donbass and agree on political, military, economic, and humanitarian measures to end the conflict. And the sooner this happens, the better. Unfortunately, right now we are seeing the opposite, an aggravation of the situation in Donbass.
But with Kiev and its allies still warning of impending Russian invasion, de-escalation appears a distant prospect.
For more on the crisis in Ukraine, I'm now joined by DW's Nick Connolly in Kiev. So, Nick, shelling has intensified in recent days in the region, and thousands of people are being evacuated. What's your read of the situation?
Well, things are definitely hotting up in Donbass, in that eastern Ukrainian region that has seen war since 2014, but where, strangely enough, things had been a bit quieter in recent months, where we had that huge Russian troop build-up along Ukraine's other borders. Very little in the way of fighting in recent weeks, up till basically the last 2 days, where we've seen even a kindergarten on the Ukrainian-controlled side being shelled, although no pupils wounded. Images of people back in the bomb shelters where they hadn't been for years, really. A very clear escalation, and something people here in Kiev, the government would say, is a sign that these separatists are basically at the beck and call of the Kremlin, able to dial up the pressure on Ukraine when Russia is at least claiming to draw back tanks and weaponry on other fronts. But a really weird situation, different reports coming in of explosions in Luhansk today, this evening rather, on gas pipelines, images of huge queues of people trying to buy fuel to get out, conflicting reports of whether men in basically military age between 18 and 55 are being allowed to leave those separatist regions, or whether they're being encouraged or indeed forced to stay and sign up for some kind of military action. So very nervous and worrying situation that people here didn't quite in Kiev imagine would go quite so fast.
Now, the U.S. government is concerned Russia could use the clashes in eastern Ukraine as a pretext to launch an invasion. Is this also something that the Ukrainian government is concerned about?
Definitely, and we've heard in recent days, not just from Vladimir Putin, but also from other Russian officials, the word genocide being used, Kiev being accused by Russian decision makers of committing genocide against its own citizens in eastern Ukraine, of using weaponry, of shelling those separatist regions, and of affecting civilians. That's something that has really come up and been really pushed by the official Russian line in recent days. Reports of mass graves of victims of the war from earlier in the conflict being found, and now legal cases being made. So the real feeling here is that this is a cause, an attempt to find a cause for war, to basically have an excuse to carry out a preventive strike against Ukraine, the line being that Ukraine is trying to take these regions back with force, and that Russia would have to come to those separatists' aid to prevent that happening. So definitely a sense now here in Kiev that this is turning into a hotter phase, that after the kind of diplomatic toing and froing of recent weeks, this is definitely now a more dangerous situation.
All right, Nick, help us understand the conflicting reports about the Russian troop buildup at the border with Ukraine. Moscow says it's pulling some of its troops back, but NATO says they are sending more troops to the region.
Well, that's the thing. At the beginning of the week, you had Olaf Scholz, Germany's chancellor, in Moscow, and he basically seemed to have been able to change the tone. We heard from the Russians in the hours and days following that visit that they were going to reduce some of those troop positionings along the Ukrainian frontier, take troops out of annexed Crimea. But if the satellite imagery that the Western intelligence agency going on is to be believed, then they are basically just redistributing those troops, taking them out of annexed Crimea and bringing them back to positions, their home garrisons, which are also very close to Ukraine's border, so nothing that really affects Ukraine's security. And indeed, new troops have been spotted in different locations, so a sense really that this was potentially just some manoeuvring, an attempt to show some goodwill towards Olaf Scholz, but no real Russian commitment to de-escalating. And indeed, it's difficult to see why they would de-escalate, because so far Russia hasn't got any of the things it was demanding. We haven't seen Vladimir Putin either get a promise from NATO to keep Ukraine out or to withdraw troops from those Eastern European NATO members. So a sense that Russia is going to keep on escalating until it sees some return on this pressure being applied to Ukraine and the West.
All right, that was DW's Nick Connolly bringing us the latest from Ukraine. Thanks for joining us.